Welcome back. In the previous video, I demonstrated how to create an animated vector drawable from scratch using solely Shapeshifter. In this video, I'm going to expand on that work using the 3D modeling app Blender. So why Blender? Blender has too many features to list in a single sentence, but in brief, it has lots of capabilities for modeling, rendering animations through shape keys and bone rigging, particle system with physics, node-based editing, and a video compositor. The Blender Foundation has funded a number of open source films to push the capabilities of the app. It's also been used in the production of commercials and some films. But the biggest reason for me to use Blender is that it's free and it runs on Linux. Although I'm using Windows on this actual recording, but I use Linux a lot. And another reason is that the community cared enough about the project to pay to free the source code. So I'm not going to lie to you. The stories about Blender's learning curve being steep are kind of true. Not because it's hard to learn, but because a lot is thrown at you at once with some odd key mappings to put the icing on the cake. The upside is you don't have to learn everything at once. So go ahead and download the latest stable version from blender.org. Depending on when you're viewing this, it might be version 2.79 or in the 2.8 branch. There are some UI and infrastructure changes planned with 2.8, but I expect things to work similarly when 2.8 is stable. Here's the default scene when you open up Blender for the first time, with a cube, a lamp, and a camera in 3D space. As opposed to Shapeshifter, where the UI was simple enough to explain most of it in one go, I'll be talking about things in Blender as we need them. So let's start by creating a couple shapes. So we can create a shape using Shift A and selecting from the drop-down, or we can use this Create tab over here and select one of the buttons. Let's create a monkey. So I already have the Transform tab here opened, but you can, if it's not open, you can open it or close it with the N key. Now that shows you for the selected object, its location, rotation, and scale. So for this monkey, we could change the Y location to say 2, and then it updates in real time. And the same with this cube. We could make that Z 3 or something like that. And the same with rotation. And we can actually use the mouse wheel to the mouse cursor to scroll this back and forth. So now that we have a couple of objects in our scene, let's render it. So we can do that by going to the render menu and render image, and it will show us all of the objects that are within the confines of our camera. We can hit escape to escape out of that. So another way that we can move objects is by using these directional vectors that show up when you have the object selected. Now that corresponds to the axes down here, where the x-axis is red, the y is green, and it's slightly obscured, but the z is blue. So if you select one of those axes, it constrains the motion to that specific axis. So we can move things up and like that. And let's render again, and we can see that things are a bit more in focus of this camera. So to recap, this is the animation that we're recreating. The same one from the first video in this series. This animation is going to be purely 2D, so I'm going to move my view and camera so that I'm creating objects along the X and Y axes and not in 3D. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete all of the objects that I've created, and you can do that with the delete key and it'll bring up a confirmation menu, or you can use the X key to do the same. Now my camera is pointing at an arbitrary point, and what I really want is for it to be pointing at 0, 0 and at some z value. And the reason for that is when this 3D view is converted to 2D, I don't have to worry about things being at a weird orientation. So I have my camera selected. What I'm going to do is for the location, I'm going to make that 0, 0, and 0. And I'm also going to clear the rotation. So now my camera is oriented at 0, 0, 0. So this is going to be the surface area that I'm creating the drawing on. So let's move our camera up. So let's move that up to about 6 or so. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to change the view to what the camera sees so I can better see my creation surface. Now one way to do that is to go into the view menu down here and select camera. So now we can see what the camera sees. And let me turn off my screencasting for a second so that you can see that this corresponds to X going this way and Y going this way. And that's essentially a top view of my surface area. So one thing that I'm going to do that's optional is move this camera to a different layer, just so that it's not clogging up things. You could leave it there, or you could design your things purely in this frame. So like in our original drawing, we're going to start with the things that don't have to move around. And in this case, nothing's going to move around in Blender yet. So let's create the face. Now we need to create a circle. Again, we can use this menu or Shift A. And we can see it's outlined here. Now if we go to render this right now, we don't see anything. The reason for that is it only creates the points of the circle. So what we need to do now is create a solid object from these vertices. The way we do that is to go into edit mode, and we can see right down here in this menu we're in object mode. We can either go to edit mode here or hit the tab key, and this shows all our vertices. Right now they're all selected. We can deselect them with the A key or reselect them all. To fill in this surface, we hit the F key, and that creates a solid object. Tab again to exit edit mode, and we have our object created. So if we go to render it, we can see that we have a full circle right now. Now to create our eyes, we're going to do the same exact process, with this time using the keys. So Shift A, create a circle, go into edit mode, make sure all the vertices are selected, F to fill it, and then exit out of edit mode with the tab key. So we can do that a third time for the other eye, or we can make sure the object is selected and hit Shift D for duplicate, and then move our mouse to move our duplicate away. Now one thing that I notice from my transform view over here is that these objects have a Z value of 2.5. And that's not necessarily what we want. To show you what I mean about the objects floating in space, let's look at them with the right view, so we can see that they're kind of all floating up there. We'd like them to be around Z equals 0. So let's move those down, and then move back to the top view. So now that we have both our eyes, we need to deform them a bit. So right now we have 3 circles on screen. We have our face and 2 eyes, but nothing is at the right scale that it should be. So let's fix that. So first we're going to move these out of the way. Another way to select an object is to use the G key and then move the mouse, as opposed to editing values here in the transform menu. Let's select our face, hit our S key for scale, and if we start dragging the mouse right now, it scales uniformly on all the axes that have a value greater than 0. If we hit Y, and I did it again. If we hit X, it scales it along the x-axis, Y for the y-axis, and this is not going to have a value on the difference really on the z-axis, since this is an infinitely thin disk. But for the face, we can just scale on the x and y at the same time, and we can do the same for our initial eye shape. And let's see, that looks about right as far as a good size. Now, because both of these eyes are going to be the same, I can either try and scale this one up to the same dimensions, this one, to the same dimensions as this one, or I could delete it and then just duplicate this one. So I'm going to do that. And to allow myself to see things a little bit better, I'm going to assign a material to these, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Let's render it, and we can see that we have our objects. We need to move our camera a little bit more. So let's render it again, and we can see our the beginnings of a face here. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move the eyes up just a little bit to make them not be coplanar with the face, so that I can see them when I'm in this view. So the next thing that we need to do is make a mouth. What we can use is the plane tool, or the plane primitive, and let's grab that and move that over here. I hit new for add a new material, and then in diffuse I can select any color that I need it to be, and I can select both RGB values from 0 to 1 on each of these, hue saturation, and also hex values. And let's make that also black, and we are going to scale this, and we're going to scale it with the S key, and we are going to constrain it to the Y axis. That looks about right, and then scale it to the X axis, constrain it to X. It's about right. Click to confirm, G to move it, and so if we render it, we have just a normal looking face here. So to create the second phase of the eyes, we can again use the plane primitive and scaling it, and let's move it over our eye. So we want to make it look like an X, so let's rotate it. Now we can use this menu here, or we can use R and rotate it by hand. Now way down here, oh, let me escape off. Down in this corner, when I hit R, it's going to show you the number of degrees that it's rotated, and also up here. So let's do, sure, that looks good. And then with that selected, we're going to hit Shift D to duplicate it, and then rotate it in the other direction. Select one, select the other while holding Shift, and then join. Now the way I brought that up is by hitting the space bar that you see down here. Alright, and now that those are joined, let's scale that down a bit to about there. And then we could duplicate it over this eye. Alright, so if we render it, now we have all the objects that we did by hand in Shapeshifter very, very quickly. So right now we're unable to use this directly in Shapeshifter because what's being generated here is just a PNG file. To turn this into something that can be used by Shapeshifter, we need to make sure a couple of plugins are enabled. So the way that we do that is going to User Preferences and typing in SVG. Now two plugins come up, one for an importer-exporter, and the second one is for the Freestyle SVG exporter. The second one is the only one that you need to be enabled, but the first one will allow you to import SVGs that you have exported from Shapeshifter. So with those turned on, let's talk about our render menu. Now we've seen this kind of sitting here over in space. Let me turn off that to have less to distract you with. But let's look at it now. So it has a number of drop downs for different settings that you can do on an animation or an individual image, like the rendering presets for different types of video, setting the resolution by hand, which frames you want to render, and a bunch of other settings. The ones that are important to us right now are the output. This specifies where the generated files are going to go. There is this freestyle drop down here and this freestyle SVG export. Let's, we can move this one up just a bit. And there are settings in this drop down for just exporting the individual frame or the SVG as an animation. When you export as a frame, if you're rendering multiple frames, it will do one file per frame. If you do an animation, it will do one file for all of the frames collected together. So with that turned on, we can render a file by going to just render image. And a way that you will know that the Freestyle plugin is add-on is enabled is that you'll see kind of cartoony outlines around everything. So when we go over to our browser, we can see that the outline of that object has been rendered. So let's try this in Shapeshifter and see what we come up with. And what we're greeted with is can't import layers from file. Now the reason for this is because Blender uses a slightly different format for its file that Shapeshifter doesn't quite understand. So if we open up the page source, there is a group here called render line set. Let's blow this up a little bit. And basically, Shapeshifter is not expecting that to be there. If Blender were established market for motion graphics targeting Android, I might hassle Alex to add native support. However, for something this experimental, I decided to target Shapeshifter's reasonably self-documented file format instead. That allows him to focus on the core features of his tool instead of spending cycles on an unproven and unadapted flow. So I have a really small project in a GitHub repo called Android AVD Tools, and it's called SVG to Shapeshifter. Okay, we have our file created here, Shapeshifter file. So let's go to the browser and check it out and open it up. We can see that it has groups for fills and strokes, and there are a lot of strokes here, many more than we might have expected. And if we turn these on and off, we can see that it looks like some objects, like these circles, have been cut into multiple strokes. So if we go back to Blender, delete one of our eyes. So when we go into our eye, we can see that although we joined it, it actually still is two different objects. So one way that we can fix that is to start again. So let's create a plane. And we're going to do a new thing. We're going to go into the edit menu and select all of our vertices and hit W to subdivide. And we're going to do that one more time. Made sure everything was deselected and hit the B key for border select. I'm going to select these three vertices right here. And I could move them, but that's going to stretch everything around. So what I really want to do is to extrude E, and I'm basically creating a new edge from there. So I drag it out to where I want it to be, and click to select, deselect those vertices, and I'm going to do that on each of the other edges. So now I have this type of shape. And I have these corners here that I don't want. So what I'm going to do is select those vertices and hit X to delete them. And then now I have my cross shape. So if we go back into our browser and import the file that we just created, we can now see that we have that cross/X shape, and it is one path as opposed to being a bunch of smaller subpaths. So let's go back into Blender, and we're going to delete this one and replace it with the new one. Duplicate that and move it to the other one. Render it out again, and that looks much better because it's one shape here. And let's convert that, and we can see that those are one shape. Now it's still drawing a lot more smaller subpaths. So as we can see in Blender, we have the different objects over top of each other. For an object where it's contained totally in the confines of another object, it's fine. Like Blender can differentiate between the outer circle and the mouth. It's having some problems figuring out the difference between these circles for the eyes and the X eyes. Alright, so one thing that we could do is just delete one of the X's and one of the eyes, and this, because they're now totally contained, it should render correctly. So now we see that we only have the strokes that we expect there to be. So one thing that I didn't explain is that by default, images and SVGs are rendered at 1080p. So that's 1920 by 1080. And there's a percentage slider, so that 50% is why when we go over to our browser, we can see that the vector layer is 960 by 540, exactly half of 1080p. So to make our animations and our SVGs a little bit more manageable, what we're going to do is bump that down to say 24 by 24. So the setting is in the render layers menu under line style and thickness, and it was previously set to 3. I've set it to 0.1, and now we have the same thing, and it's at a more reasonable size. Okay, so I have pretty much everything back the way that it was at decent sizes. So I am going to go ahead and recreate my animation stuff. So for me, that was a lot faster than working solely in Shapeshifter, and it also allowed me to have a drawing that was a bit simpler, and we got to allow each tool to do what it does best. In the next video, I'll show you how you can use Blender to handle even more of the animation. Thanks for watching, and keep learning.